Hi, everyone, and welcome to this discussion on how to build a better global internet, or at least how not to screw up the internet we presently have anymore. I'm Ian Bremmer. I am president of Eurasia Group and other things. I am joined by Michelle Zatlyn, who is co-founder, president, and COO of Cloudflare, the internet security and reliability company, and Tony Blair, who you all know, the former UK Prime Minister and the executive chairman of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. I'm glad, because it'd be strange to say someone else was the executive chairman of the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Where really Tony asked me to do this, so I mean he gets what he deserves, right? And we are really looking forward to a pretty wide-ranging discussion about technology and geopolitics and the challenges facing the global open, as it stands, internet, which is the subject of TBI's latest report called The Open Internet on the Brink, a model to save its future. And thanks to all of you in the audience right now who submitted questions. We'll come to those a little bit later on in a fast-moving conversation. And of course, please do tweet your comments and your questions to @InstituteGC. So to kick this off, I mean, clearly this is an environment where when we started the World Wide Web, it was the context of globalization, ideas and people and goods and services and capital moving faster and faster and faster across borders. And as a consequence, a world that had seen more progress, less poverty, greater life expectancy, more education than at any point in time in human history, and by a staggering amount. And yet, when we talk about this issue this week, we increasingly talk about fragmentation, we talk about decoupling, people talk even about a technology Cold War, and just a couple of days ago, we talked about how none of us for 6 hours could access Facebook or WhatsApp, or for those of you that have photos of things, Instagram. All seemed very problematic. So let me kick it off with Tony and ask, what's the state of the global internet right now? How broken do you think it is, and what's its promise?
Okay, and first of all, thanks very, very much for doing this, and welcome to you and Michelle. I'm really grateful to you for hosting this discussion based around the report, excellent report that my people in the Institute have produced. So I think we're really in this position, which is, and let me put it from a policymaker's point of view, because Michelle can put it much better from a technical point of view. But from the policymaker's point of view, there's been this explosive power of the internet, which, by the way, has liberated lots of things and lots of people. And in the work, for example, my institute does in many countries in Africa, I can see, even with the limited internet access there is on the continent, the internet's had an amazing empowering effect. But of course, the technology's grown and changed. The power of the internet has developed and accelerated. And we're left at the moment with a dislocation between the current state of things and policy. So that is being, I think, exacerbated by several factors. Number one, the two main powers in this, the United States and China, are locked in confrontation. So that's obviously got a real question and issue to resolve from the policy point of view. Secondly, there's real concerns over supply chains, semiconductor chips, submarine cables. Thirdly, you have still a situation in which roughly half the world doesn't have internet access, but they will acquire it. And what are the standards, and what are the companies they're going to be using in order to change their situation? And finally, you've got what people call this fragmentation of the internet, where countries are looking at this issue of digital sovereignty in quite a narrow way, thinking, how do I make sure my own system works, and looking somewhat inwards in order to gauge that, when there's an obvious need with the internet in its present state for countries to cooperate across national boundaries, and in particular, given this overhanging issue of America and China, to work out how let's say, at least the democracies of the world stand, because the Chinese model of the internet is obviously very different from that developed by America and Europe and in the West. So I think we're at a stage now where it's absolutely right to have the conversation at an international level about what are the things that are going to improve the internet so that you keep its openness, but you give people security, you extend its access, and you make sure that that fragmentation that otherwise will cut a lot of the economic and social benefits of the internet does not happen. So making sense of that from the policy point of view is, I think, the central challenge for countries today.
So, Michelle, I think it's fair to say that people around the world were surprised that a company of Facebook's size could suddenly go down on the basis of what seems to be fairly insignificant user error internally. And you, of course, wrote a piece on this that was downloaded, I guess, well over 1 million times, right? Explaining it. I mean, Tony was saying beforehand that you almost explained it to him, which means this was really, not a super wonky techno approach to what the hell happened. So first, I think it'd be really interesting for people to hear from you what happened briefly, and then apply that more broadly, because of course, with the pandemic, we all learned that just-in-time supply chain is really good for profits, and yet really vulnerable to sudden shocks. And do we have a problem of that is exponentially greater in terms of our digital economy, in terms of the World Wide Web, in terms of all of this virtuality that increasingly we spend so much of our time and money on?
Well, there are a lot of questions in there, Ian. So let me see if I can hit all of them. And thanks so much for having me here. I'm excited to be here discussing all of these topics. So let me start with your last point, and then I'll go into maybe a little bit more about what happened and what does that mean. I think that the fact that that Facebook, one of the largest companies in the world, went offline for 6 hours, is actually just shows that there's an opportunity. And again, I'm a very optimistic, half glass full person. I think that there's an opportunity for entrepreneurs out there, as an entrepreneur myself, there are more tools that need to get built, there are more systems and process, and we're so early in the web's evolution and even the internet's evolution, and it's not going away. It's going to get stronger and better, and that's the opportunity. And this is why we're here talking about it, because it's, hey, how do you bring the policymakers, the private sector, the governments together to make all tides rise? Is how I think about it. So what happened with Facebook was a fairly simple user error, and these things happen to every single company. Things happen, and the internet is a very complex, interconnected systems of systems. So one mistake somewhere can have a cascading effect, but that's okay. That's okay. It got fixed in 6 hours. I'm sure Facebook would have loved it to get fixed a lot faster, but that's okay. And it wasn't a user error. And technically what happened was, think about going to mail a letter. You go to mail a letter at the post office. You put an address on the letter, okay, so you know where the letter is getting sent. And so I live in San Francisco. Let's say I'm sending a letter to New York City. Okay, so I go and I address the letter to New York City. I go take it to the post office. It has the address on it. The post office can get it from San Francisco to New York in many different ways. There's lots of routes to go from San Francisco to New York in the mail system. Online is the same thing. And so what happened with Facebook, the initial mistake was they erased the routes of how to find their address online. So all of a sudden, everyone knew where Facebook was, but you couldn't get there. All the routes were erased. It's called BGP. That's the technology that does all the routing of the internet. So the routes got erased. So then no one could find the end address because no one knew how to get from, in this case, San Francisco or New York in my analogy. And that was what was happening. And then what happened was, because they used a lot of their own systems, they couldn't quickly regain access to what would be called the control panel to go and reverse that mistake very quickly. They knew very quickly that the routes got erased, but they couldn't get access to the systems they needed to do to go put them back in. And that's what took a long time. So they knew very quickly what the mistake was. It just took a long time to fix. And so their teams, I am sure, I don't know, but if I was them, I'd be going through, okay, where were all the points of failure? How do we make sure this never happens again? And what's been interesting is every other company should do the same thing. this is an example of where all tides can rise, is the fact that we had this event on Monday. We should all be asking internally at our organizations, if that happened to us, how would we fare? If we erased our BGP routes, what would happen? Who would go? Could we get access to our control panels? And we could all, including at Cloudflare, we've already made changes saying, wow, we could learn from this to get stronger as an organization so we are better prepared if or when that comes up. And I think that is, I think the web is one of a constant state of learning. And this is an example of a learning opportunity that can make everyone stronger. And so that's on that point. And, you know, I think that what Tony said in his opening, which really resonated with me, is so right. We are at this point. And you know, from my perspective, technology has changed all how we live and interact and how we work and learn. And that's amazing. It's all these amazing things. We want to keep all of those things, but it hasn't been perfect. There have been bad actors. There have been bad things that have happened. And so in this next set of conversations, it's how do we mitigate the negative side, well, without ruining all the great things that are part of the internet and technology. And I'll end my comments and then we can go move on. It's why is it now? Why it's now is I strongly believe is the following reasons. About 10 years ago, there were 8 tech companies that had market caps over $100 billion. That's it, 8. They were considered the nerds in the corner. Nobody cared. Today, there are over 30 in less than a decade. It's accelerated very quickly. And so these very large companies are getting built that are having economic, just have a lot of economic power in their markets. And I think that's why it's rising a lot more to the forefront. Personal data, much more rising to the forefront. And it's like, wow, how do we move forward from here? Because this isn't going away. It's kind of a gaining steam. Policymakers, what responsibilities do we have to our citizens of our country to set kind of acceptable business standards and norms and how to do this? How do we make sure our populations are tech literate? And these are really important things that governments can do. Meanwhile, the entrepreneurs, the private sector side can be like, okay, how do we build the tools to help harness this for good and create more economic value and not extract it in a way that is responsible? And then all of us as digital citizens, where we vote every day with our wallets and our attention, spending time with companies that you want, that you believe in a way that lines up with your values and not one that is antithesis. And I think that's the opportunity going forward.
So Michelle, you bring us to governance, and I'm going to turn to Tony on that. But before I do, I have a very short follow-up for you, simply because I want to know if what happened to Facebook, given what you just said, could that have happened as easily to Microsoft or Amazon? Because, I mean, the impact of that on like shutting down many of the world's biggest corporations for a day would have been unprecedented and staggering. Is that possible?
It is possible. And so can I just say it in a slightly, it is possible, but again, we have to normalize this idea that the internet is super complex. Things go wrong all the time. They don't make it to the front page of the newspaper. And it's happening all the time. And so this idea, it's always going to be 100% online and perfect, is an impossible standard to reach to. It's one that we should strive to, and we should constantly be saying, how do we make this better and more resilient? And so, yes, other things can go wrong, but that's not the reason to lean out and be like, we shouldn't do it. It's more, okay, how do we have risk management plans to minimize any sort of risk of these things happening?
Could an external actor do this deliberately? I mean, could they sabotage that system? And by the way, this time I really did understand why the outage happened.
Yes, I mean, yes, that can happen. And so some of the other high profile attacks, like the Colonial Pipeline attack that happened in the United States, that was from an outside bad actor, or even the SolarWinds. There was another cyber attack recently in the news called the SolarWinds. That was an outside attacker. And in each case, what I appreciate is a lot of what happened became very public and transparent. And again, I think good security in these cases, hygiene would be, what can we learn from it so that all organizations can get stronger? Is there a role for governments to change something to help protect us going forward? And so it's this constant iteration of what are we learning? How do we make it? I think a good test would be for it never to happen a second time. of never allow the same mistake to happen the same time, second time, and mistake being either an internal or some sort of external. And once something bad happens, how fast can you detect it and mitigate it? And of course you want to stop it. That's the best. Upstream. Don't ever allow it to happen. But if it happens, then what? How fast can we detect it ourselves that something was, in this case, breached with a bad actor? And how quickly could we revert it? What would be our tools? And those are the sorts of things that a shout out to all of the security teams around the world who are thinking about this and living in this. I think a lot of boardrooms are talking about this. I mean, I know that a lot of boards are looking at this. I recently joined the Atlassian board where they have a whole risk matrix of what would happen if this, and a very detailed plan. And that's good governance and a good way to run your business in an online world. And I think more businesses are going in that way. We need even more. We're very early. But that is the future that's not going away, and it's going to be continuing to become more and more important.
So I mean, if we had more time on this panel, I'd lean in and start talking about malware and implications of it, how far it's going, but we don't. So maybe we will with the public Q&A. Instead, I want to turn to governance. So at least touch on some of the big picture questions that are raised from Tony's report, because you talk to world leaders. There's so much attention being spent to response to pandemic, and not in a very coordinated fashion. Ditto on climate, not in a very coordinated fashion. This has in some ways been the ugly stepchild, because there isn't a lot of architecture. There aren't a lot of leaders that really understand it. And to the extent that there's a global approach, it is a radically different approach in terms of the Europeans, in terms of the Americans, between the Democrats and the Republicans, and certainly in terms of the Chinese. So before we dig into those actors themselves, I'd like to talk a little bit, Tony, about your conversations with world leaders, where you see them, what you see them doing, and what you see them missing in terms of leadership and governance on this issue.
Yeah, so I think the first thing is that for a lot of policymakers, technology and technology innovation is something they, in principle, understand the importance of, but in detail, find incredibly difficult and challenging. And, I always say part of the problem is one of the things that my institute majors on, is why we have a whole section of it dedicated to this. I think one of the biggest problems today is that the change makers and the policy makers are in two different rooms, and they only intersect occasionally, and they often talk absolutely past each other. And what it means is if you go into any group of parliamentarians in the Western world and you talk about technology, they'll almost certainly immediately go to Facebook and privacy, but they're much less comfortable dealing with these types of large issues that are obviously, I mean, in the end of my view, dramatically more important. I'm not relegating the importance of the privacy question, but these questions of, for example, how you make sure there's some system of global governance, how, for example, America and Europe come together around regulation and standards and a common approach. I mean, this is of huge importance, but I find that the sort of conversation around coordination very thin. So I think it's partly a lack of comprehension, and it's partly because people come at this from a completely different lens. But I think so the Europeans have always tended to come at it from a very much a public interest value lens. The Americans come at it from a more laissez-faire lens. It's not to be said that the Americans have created bigger and greater companies doing it their way. But the point is, both of those approaches, they're not wholly inconsistent with each other, but they are absolutely inconsistent with the authoritarian model of the internet that is essentially the one that China is developing. And the reason why I think this is so important is when you look at that 3.7 billion people who don't have internet access, and you assume, which I think is true, that they are going to acquire it slowly or more quickly, depending on lots of different factors. And when you think, for example, that the One Belt, One Road initiative of China's got a major part of it around infrastructure and technology, is very important, I think, for those policymakers in the West to come together. So some of the things we're suggesting in the report allow allow leaders to come together and focus upon this question of the openness of the internet and how you govern it as a specific issue in its own right, not something to be tagged on at the end of long communiques on other things. I think for the first time in the G7 this year, there was actually a proper discussion about it, which is important. But it needs, it needs, in fact, the same energy that's given to the climate debate to be given to this political energy.
And when you think about the US-China relationship, and a bit more broadly, the West relationship with China, and certainly with America's allies in Asia, as well as Canada and the UK, there has been more alignment on a lot of those issues than they have been with the EU. How much decoupling do you think is necessary, is desirable? I mean, you talk about core national security elements, and of course, I mean, the Americans wouldn't want to give that up to the Chinese. The Chinese have an authoritarian political system. They demand a level of surveillance over their citizens as a consequence that American citizens would certainly resist and find distasteful. It's not like we care as much about privacy as the Europeans do. How do you approach the question of globalization, integration, and one World Wide Web, as opposed to the geopolitical lens of a United States that sees China today as its principal strategic competitor and adversary?
Yeah, well, it's a huge question, and you write a lot about this, Ian, and those people who are lucky enough to receive your weekly briefings get a huge insight from them about the state of play on decoupling in the America-China relationship. I think we've not found the answer to this properly at the moment. But here's how I approach it from a strategic point of view. I think that China is developing a view of the internet which we would find unacceptable in our systems. On the other hand, I think the risk of a complete decoupling is that you get into a competition that leads to confrontation in circumstances where I'm not really sure that that is going to be to our ultimate benefit. And therefore, what I think is we should do two things. First of all, we need to try and come to some agreements from a position of strength as to what are some common rules that we're going to have in common. And one of the reasons why I put that question to Michelle is, obviously one area of this is around cybersecurity, because the damage that we can do to each other on this is immense and incalculable. So I think there is a set of agreements that we could and should try to make, a set of common understandings as to how we're going to operate with each other. And then secondly, I think there is an area of cooperation around how we make sure that we're not actually in confrontation with each other when it comes to the developing world and the access they require to the internet. And we should be trying to make sure that those countries that as they develop access have the right to their own, they are masters of their own destiny in terms of the systems that they choose. But also where you look at some of these supply chain questions, I know that we, in a sense, are decoupling to a degree in that area, but it's also in our common interests that we're both able to service the internet. So I think that I think there's going to be no way out of the recognition that the values underpinning America and Europe on the one side, or let's call it the D10, because even though India has a different system, they are a democracy, share basically the same position as we do. And on the other side of it, China, although you're going to have to that degree that confrontation, I think you've got to try and carve out within that some practical rules that allow us to coexist. Because otherwise the consequences of trying to decouple absolutely and to confront, I think, are going to be very painful for both sides.
Michelle, you have, of course, a different lens when you think about China. Your business does business in China. You're not decoupled, even though it's a very different rule set. Talk about a little bit about not just what you guys do, but rather how you think, as a consequence of that, we should be structuring the broader relationship of the internet with the Chinese.
I mean, I think Tony said it so eloquently, and I just want to take a moment to say congratulations on the report, Tony. I think it's really well done and very much needed, because this is a topic that you called them change makers and policy makers. I think of them sometimes as policy wonks and geeks. I think that all technologists need to become better policy makers. So all change makers need to become better, understand policy better, and the policy makers need to understand the tech better. And to me, that's the future. The people who lean into that are going to basically get to define all of these rules and norms and standards that will govern for the next 10 or 20 years. So I think that's exciting. So I hope there's someone on this call that gets fired up by that and helps be the change you want to see. We need more of that collaboration. I'm very much in the camp of one, open internet is better. I mean, and I think we all agree on that. So sometimes panels aren't very exciting when you all agree. So I couldn't agree more with everything Tony said and what that means and where the conflict is, and to try and de-escalate there, and how do you do that. I think that there is, kind of to the question before, to the point before, around, for us, one of the things that Cloudflare offers is cybersecurity. And it turns out that is when you sometimes have a shared, I want to say, common pain point, it's easier to get cooperation, and nobody wants to have a security breach. Nobody does. No, like that is a universal, like, it's just no business, no government. It's something that's a universal shared pain. And so we do have a partnership with some companies in China. We help provide that to both our customers having access, because they do business in China. They have a huge commerce there. And then to Chinese companies who are starting to do business outside of China too. It's really interesting. And that's the opportunity. We've been able to find a common ground to move forward. And so the policy question is much better suited for Tony, but from a private sector, I do think shining some light on where some of the bright spots are, or where it is going well, is good for both countries in this case. Like, I think it's not all bad. There is some places where there has been cooperation and common ground, and it's been a win-win-win, and it's been productive. And whatever we decide to do to help mitigate some of the bad side, I hope we don't ruin the good side either, because there are some bright spots and there are other companies, and I think that's good. The other thing I will say, just as the policymakers and the government start to think about what's next, I think sometimes the US is a common enemy where they think, wow, all of the economic value has accrued in an outsized manner to the US. And I think that causes some resentment to some of the current status quo. And so this is back to the innovators, the change makers. Think about, how do you build your business? How do you build this next big global company in your hometown or in the country you live in? And one other way is more positive stories of large success stories happening in many, many countries around the world, building great tools and services that help all of their customers, and therefore make all of our lives easier and better and less expensive. I think that is also another really great path forward that hasn't brought up for, where don't pack your bags and come to the US, do it in your home country, and more successes spread around is a good antidote to some of the risks that lie ahead.
And the reason I'm glad that you both addressed that point is, as Tony mentioned, I've been doing a lot of work on decoupling, and we saw that despite what's being said at the governmental level, about 90% of US corporates are assertively not decoupling from China. They're either maintaining status quo or they're increasing. And more than are decoupling, actually think that China is their single most important international market for the future. But to the extent that there is a problem, a lot of the problem is increasingly focusing on this issue of the internet, because the models are increasingly very disparate. So I think it's a really important area for us to all discuss. And now I get to switch to be a panelist, which is what I'm more used to anyway. And we're going to bring Max onto the stage, who is going to lead us into all of your questions.
Thanks very much, Ian, for leading such a fascinating conversation. So I'm going to kick off with some audience questions and to turn it to you, Ian, about geopolitics. Picking up on Michelle's last point about the US administration. What would you say is the Biden administration's main aim for foreign policy and tech at the moment? There's a lot of chat about the Summit for Democracies next year and how that will consider the internet and tech, but should we be hopeful? What should we be thinking about now?
It's pretty clear that the priority for the United States is for Biden and has been for Trump is much more domestic. And I think that the big meeting that they just had, Jake Sullivan with his opposite number in Zurich in the last 24 hours, was by far the best meeting that the US has had with China of the Biden administration. And it was the equivalent of the Biden-Putin meeting in Geneva. It was an effort to say, let's not let this get worse. No more Cold War talk. No more talk about Taiwan. We're going to have World War III. No. We need to work with each other. And the speech by Catherine Tai, the U.S. trade representative at the beginning of the week, that also was focused on how do we don't agree with each other. And we're not going to convince the Chinese to do a phase 2 trade deal. So let's not even talk about it. But we are incredibly interdependent. And we also need to cooperate on all of these issues of greater global concern, like, for example, this massive expansion of malware that Tony and Michelle were just talking about. And we need Chinese engagement on that. And, I will tell you that when John Kerry went to Biden a few weeks ago privately and said that Anchorage summit with Blinken and Sullivan and the Chinese was a disaster. There was no strategy. All you did was threaten and beat up the Chinese. And Biden's response to Kerry privately was, you're right. You're right. And we don't want that. We need to fix that. So, I wouldn't say that Biden has this great global strategy for how we're going to build back better on the internet. Like, no, I don't see that happening. And I think Tony's right in the fact that there just isn't the expertise or the strategy or the prioritization. But I do think that Biden does not want to spend the rest of his term fighting a Cold War with China. And he's willing to put some effort in and even be willing to take some hits domestically to help ensure that doesn't happen. I think the last 48 hours has been a significant move in that direction.
And turning it to slightly kind of the edge of geopolitics, obviously we have very large multinational tech companies that increasingly have incredible kind of geopolitical power and influence. How do you see these tech companies in this world? How do you see their influence? What approach do you think states should be taking to dealing with tech companies, and are we in the right place?
So I think Michelle made a very important point earlier when she just pointed out the exponential growth of the power of these large companies. And the truth is, the other feature, obviously, the problem at Facebook is just the sheer impact, right? The fact that all around the world, not in China, obviously, there's a devastating consequence. So the power of these companies, we've written about this before the Institute, it's so enormous now that I think there's got to be some way of ensuring that the issues raised by that power, the public interest issues, are properly governed and dealt with sensibly. And that's why, one of the things that we've suggested in the paper, for example, is that you really need to bring these companies together and have an iterative engagement with them, where you're coming out with certain clear principles as to how they're going to operate and how those public interest values are going to be recognized. And I think this is something that they kind of understand. I think that they need to do this. But again, it's something that needs to be led by people who are in government, who are policymakers, who say, because you say that with this power has got to come some form of responsibility, and yet there's no way of delineating that responsibility and turning it into certain key and agreed standards. So because I'm hesitant that if you end up going down the path, for example, of splitting these companies up or trying to deal with them by dismantling parts of them, I'm not sure that's what's going to work. But I don't think you can afford to have a situation where there's that much power vested in private sector companies without a strong public interest dimension being put in some form of coherent framework.
Thanks. And a question from Bremmer Natrukwu for Michelle. I think it's probably interesting for you to take this one. Given Cloudflare has written and been quite engaged in issues about human rights online. So how should we think about the issue of human rights and the control that particularly repressive governments use over the internet in their countries? Should we be seeing this as a security question, or should we be seeing it as a kind of human rights question? What, as a big technology company that works in lots of different countries, how do you think about this issue?
Yeah, so we see the internet as a miracle. It's changed how we work and live and find information. It's amazing what it's done to our lives. It's one of the life's greatest inventions. And you only have to look at the last 18 months to see how much that's true. I don't know if people appreciated that as much, but if you just think of the last 18 months, we couldn't see each other physically, but how the internet held us together. We could still work, we could still connect. Imagine that this health pandemic would have happened 20 years ago. It would have been very different. And so again, I think the internet is this amazing miracle that we are all benefiting from. And so on this question of this human right, absolutely think it's a human right, absolutely should be a human right. And so we absolutely support that. Some of the things that haven't come up in today's conversation is that sometimes what we're seeing more of are governments are just shutting the internet off so that their citizens don't have access to this information or to do things online. And I think that there's an opportunity here to come together on the policymakers to say, no, if it is a human right, you can't just shut off access without repercussions. And that would be a good step forward, because removing access to countries is a threat. And one of the things that we've started to do actually is, because we are such a global company, and I think this is an interesting, for other private companies that are tuning in today saying, hey, what else can I do? How can I become a better policymaker? I think trying to figure out where you can help. And so one of the things we've seen is, because we have 27 million internet properties using Cloudflare service, they're all around the world, it's very global. And so very quickly we can see when traffic drops in a particular region around the world. And so we've now started to give that information to human rights organizations who can then go use the data and the information and that situation to hopefully go push forward this conversation around a human right. And then again, both have consequences when that right is taken away. And so that's one of the things that we're doing that we're really proud of, that work. And I think other private companies thinking about where do you have some asset that you could help move this conversation forward would be a good place to start.
Yeah, that's very interesting and great to hear about the steps that Cloudflare is taking. Turning back to you, Ian. So one of the other big things that happened this week is the German elections. And yeah, I think you've said that you'll be spending more time in Brussels post Merkel because of the and its influence on trade and tech policy. It'd be great to hear a bit more about where you think the EU is going, if it's in the right direction on that. And I guess a question for you then, maybe Tony, after this, where do you think Britain fits into this geopolitical puzzle?
Well, if you listen to the French, the Brits are just opportunists, so, just kind of show up at the last minute. And I'm interested in how Tony responds to that, because of course the French are trying an Indo-Pac national security policy. They're trying a third way for themselves on artificial intelligence, but the rest of the Europeans aren't with them. So not only do the Americans not trust them on issues of industrial espionage and intelligence sharing and Five Eyes, but the Europeans don't want to move in that direction. So if that's true with Macron, and the Italians have great leadership, but that happens once every 100 years, and then it goes to something else. And the Germans will have still a strong centrist government, but they won't have Merkel. it's going to be a lot weaker. And it's going to take Olaf Scholz, assuming he becomes the chancellor, which looks very likely, quite some time to build up anything remotely close to that credibility. You're talking about Brussels. You're talking about rulemaking in areas where other people aren't making effective rules. And in some areas, the EU is quite effective on that front. I mean, think about climate. I mean, if you ask me, the action on climate isn't going to be on the COP26, where the Americans and the Chinese don't trust each other, the developed and developing world doesn't trust each other. It's increasingly going to be in the EU, and it's going to be in the private sector, the banks and others that are driving changes very quickly. Well, I mean, on technology, you can't quite say that, because the technology companies themselves they control, they are masters of their own walled gardens. But the Europeans don't like that. And they don't like it in part because it really undermines the social contract. They also don't like it because they don't have any of those companies, right? So, I mean, there isn't that. Part of the reason why Tony said, well, the Americans, Europeans have different approaches, but they can be more cooperative is because they both bring two very different skill sets, expertise, constraints, gravitational thrusts. And we need to be in each other's orbit. And we're not quite right now, but we need to be. And I'd like to believe that the Europeans will become more effective in helping to push some of the solutions that aren't about breaking up the companies. They're not just about, we can't allow Facebook for anyone under 18. It has to be more about what's going on inside. When we say that we want access, we're not just saying we want access to the internet. We want access to what the hell these algorithms do. We don't want to be beta testing on literally the brains of kids in the planet. We want to know what it means to roll out a new way of people getting information. And I think the Europeans are doing a better job of starting to address that. Moose, my dog, doesn't agree, but than the Americans are. And I'd like to believe that going forward, I fully expect I personally and my firm will be spending a lot more time in Brussels on these issues as a consequence.
Look, Britain, I think, so my basic view is, as I said, that the Americans and the Europeans should try to form a much closer bond of cooperation on things like standard, regulation, what we're trying to do. I think, for example, if they combine together to start offering internet access to that part of the planet that doesn't have it at the moment. I mean, one of the reasons why China is going to be very, very effective in helping countries develop their infrastructure is that anyone who's ever dealt with the Chinese in Africa know that whatever the problems are, they act fast. If you're an African leader, you try to get some infrastructure done in your country through the West, you get locked up in committees and bureaucracy and World Bank reports and box ticking exercises, and it takes forever. So there are things that we could do, America and Europe together, that I think would be very practical and very much in support of the openness of the internet, but also extending access. And Britain, even outside of the European Union, I mean, look, I will say to people that, through Brexit, to mention the dreaded word, I mean, you can alter the political relationship you have with Europe, but you can't alter your values or your interests or your geography. So in the end, this is an area where there's no reason why, even outside of Europe, especially since Britain actually has a technology edge over most of the rest of the European Union, most of Europe, there's no reason whatever why we couldn't cooperate with Europe, work with Europe, and be part of helping build that bridge, transatlantic bridge between the America and the Europeans. So I think Britain does have a role to play in this, but it's got to do it recognizing that will mean working with other European countries. And at the moment, I'm afraid the relationship between the UK and the European Union is pretty fractious.
Hearing all of you speak, I just am struck by this. There's just such an opportunity for all of us, and like private sector and the public and the governments and the policymakers to come together to build a path that ensures that technology brings opportunity for everyone and not just the limited few. And I think like that's the opportunity ahead of us. And I think it'd be interesting, we could kind of unify over this common goal of saying, how do we do that? How do we bring opportunity for everyone and all tides rise? I think that I don't know, that's the world that I want to see, path that I want to see going forward. And I think everyone has a role to play.
Well, I think that's the perfect line to end this excellent conversation on. So thank you, Michelle, Zatlyn, Tony Blair, Ian Bremmer for expertly moderating that. I'm sorry I haven't got to everybody's questions, but do join us on Twitter Spaces to continue this conversation, to have your own points of view. So join the tech policy team, so follow institute.gc. Thank you once again to the panel, to this conversation, to Ian, Michelle, to Tony, and do check out our technology policy work at the Institute's website. Thank you very much, everybody.